Who was the man who bent kings to his will and reshaped the world with fire and steel? Hear the thunder of cannons, the clash of swords, and the cries of armies led by one name, Napoleon. Tonight, let this tale of ambition, triumph, and downfall carry you gently to pearl sleep. Welcome to Twilight Tales. Chapter 1. The Roots of a Conqueror. Part 1. The Child of Corsica. On the dawn of August 15th, 1769, the Tyrrhenian Sea stretched like a silver mirror beneath a sky still heavy with the mists of the night. On the island of Corsica, recently wrested from the Genoese to come under French domination, a child let out his first cry in the austere Bonaparte house in Ajaccio. This fragile child, with a broad forehead and dark eyes glowing like embers, bore the name Napoleone Bonaparte. Around his cradle, the sharp scent of the maquis, olive trees, and fig trees seemed to mingle with his destiny, as if nature itself sought to imprint its mark on the one who would one day shake the world. His mother, Letizia Ramolino, a woman of stone and iron, held the newborn close. She had endured war, the gallops of Corsican partisans, the fury of revolts against Genoa and France. In her eyes shone a silent conviction. Her son was not born to fade, but to rise. For Napoleon was born on a land of struggles, an island where every stone bore the memory of resistance, and where the mountains seemed like natural fortresses defying empires. In the narrow streets of Ajaccio, footsteps echoed on the cobblestones, and Corsican voices rose with that rugged, melodic roughness that wavered between defiance and melancholy. The child grew up in a modest but tradition-steeped household. The father, Carlo Bonaparte, a lawyer without wealth, believed in the potential greatness of his lineage. An admirer of Pasquale Paoli, the hero of Corsican independence, Carlo fueled the fire of a republican dream in his stories, an ideal that young Napoleone absorbed eagerly. Family evenings often unfolded around a simple table lit by the flickering flame of candles. Letizia, stoic and unyielding, instilled discipline and piety in her children. Carlo, meanwhile, recounted tales of the ancients, evoking wars, heroes, and battles fought for the island's freedom. Young Napoleone, silent, listened with wide eyes, absorbing every word as if already noting lessons of courage and sacrifice. His childhood was harsh. The Bonapartes were not wealthy, and bread was sometimes scarce on the table. But the young boy found in the Corsican landscape a far greater school. He loved to venture into the myrtle and rosemary-scented hills, to listen to the song of the wind rushing through the pines, to feel the sea salt on his lips as he ran along the shore. In those moments, he imagined himself a shepherd of the highlands, but also a warlord, leading men beyond the mountains. At night, in his narrow room, by the wavering light of an oil lamp, Napoleone devoured the pages of Plutarch's parallel lives. Alexander the Great, Hannibal, Caesar, these ancient figures were his soul's brothers. He sometimes whispered their names before falling asleep, like prayers or omens. I too will walk where the world trembles. These words, spoken softly, were not a child's fantasy, but the proclamation of a fierce will. One day, still just a teenager, he confided to his brother Joseph, "We are destined for great things, Joseph. France believes it dominates us, but I will make France itself bend." Joseph laughed at this audacity But in Napoleone's dark eyes burned a flame no mockery could extinguish. His character was forged in solitude. Often rejected by the children of Ajaccio's notables, who mocked his rough accent and brusque manners, he learned to harden himself. Corsican pride was his armor, silence his strategy. At 10 years old, he could sit motionless for hours on a hill, gazing at the sea's horizon, as if already searching for the path to his future conquests. But behind the roughness lay a hidden sensitivity. He wrote awkward poems, meditations on freedom, passionate letters revealing a feverish soul. In these writings, he defined himself as a future soldier of justice, and each time he saw his mother watching him with that benevolent severity, he understood that he would need to turn his dreams into actions. The island, however, never ceased to remind him of its contradictions. Corsican by birth, French by obligation, Napoleone grew up between two worlds. This duality would mark his entire life. Insular and universal, a son of poverty yet destined for thrones, he already belonged to two destinies. One winter evening, as rain pounded Ajaccio's rooftops, Carlo took his son aside. His voice, deep and weary, resonated like a prophecy. "You will leave this island, Napoleon. You will be sent to France far from us, but never forget who you are. A Bonaparte of Corsica. Never bow your head, even before kings." The young boy clenched his fists, his gaze hardened by a nascent resolve. In his heart, the sea became a promise. Soon he would leave Ajaccio, but he would carry with him the scent of immortelles, the ruggedness of the mountains, and the memory of his ancestors. Thus ended the Corsican childhood, a solitary child, nourished by ancient dreams, forged by an indomitable island. Already the winds of destiny were rising. In the Mediterranean night, the waves seemed to whisper his name, Napoleon. Part 2. The Cadet of Brienne. At the age of 9, the child of Corsica left his island for the first time. The journey was long and grueling. The rough sea tossed the frail vessel carrying him to France. On deck, young Napoleone, his features already serious, gazed at the waves as if challenging the ocean. Behind him, the Corsican mountains faded, dark silhouettes dissolving into the mist. Before him, an unknown continent opened, full of promises and perils. His father, Carlo, had secured a scholarship for him through his connections with French authorities. This rare privilege for a modest family would send him to the military school of Brienne-le-Château in Champagne. There, far from his native land, Napoleon would immerse himself in a world where his Corsican accent, poverty, and isolation would test him more harshly than future battles. When the heavy doors of the school closed behind him, Napoleon felt the cold pierce him to the bone. Everything here exuded rigor, austere walls, icy corridors, impeccable uniforms. The other students, sons of nobles and wealthy families, looked down on this small Corsican in a worn coat with dark, intense eyes. The mockery began immediately. They called him savage, foreigner, provincial. His rough tongue and guttural accent sparked stifled laughter. But Napoleon did not bend. Silence became his weapon. He withdrew into fierce solitude, responding to insults with a fiery gaze. Already he knew how to turn humiliation into energy, solitude into discipline. Every morning, before dawn, he devoted long hours to study. Mathematics, geometry, military history, anything that could feed his warrior spirit absorbed him. His teachers, initially wary, soon noticed the brilliance of this young student. In strategy exercises, he displayed an imagination and relentless logic. His peers, forced to acknowledge his intellectual superiority, began to respect him despite themselves. Yet this recognition did not erase the pain of isolation. Often, in the silence of the dormitories, he stared at the stone ceiling, thinking of his mother back in Corsica. He recalled her stern yet protective gaze, her deep voice repeating countless times, "Napoleone, endure. He who endures triumphs." These words echoed like a mantra when he gritted his teeth against humiliations. One day, while wandering alone in Brienne's park, a classmate approached to provoke him. Insults flew, and soon a fight broke out. Napoleone, frail but fervent, threw himself at his opponent with savage energy. He was forcibly separated, but that day his comrades understood that the little Corsican was not a child to be broken. Behind his taciturn demeanor hid a will of iron. His passion for history grew stronger. He spent hours rereading the exploits of Caesar and Hannibal, drawing maps, imagining battles. Sometimes he scribbled entire campaign plans on sheets, as if already seeing himself at the head of armies. His teachers, intrigued, noted his precocity. This young boy seemed possessed by a vision greater than his age. In winter, Champagne was blanketed in snow. In the school's courtyard, students engaged in mock battles. There, Napoleone shone. While others playfully threw snowballs, he organized his comrades like real troops, sketching ice fortifications, devising attack and defense plans. Soon, Brienne's snow wars became legendary, and Napoleone was always their undisputed general. His once mocking peers found themselves following his orders, captivated by his ability to command. But deep down, this military childhood remained marked by solitude. In his private journal he wrote, "I was born to command, but I am alone. Let them laugh at me today. One day they will fear me." The image of Corsica never left him. On nostalgic evenings, he softly murmured the Corsican songs of his childhood. He dreamed of rugged mountains, the scent of wild shrubs, the deep blue of the Mediterranean. France was for him a foreign land, a necessary exile. But in this inner conflict, a conviction was born. If he was to triumph, he would need to conquer not only his enemies, but the contempt of the entire world. At Brienne, he caught the attention of Abbot Chardon, one of his teachers, who declared one day, "This boy will go far. In his eyes shines the spark of men chosen by destiny." This phrase Napoleon never forgot. It resonated within him like a prophecy, confirming his own premonitions. Already he saw himself not as a humiliated cadet, but as a future leader. When in 1784 he was admitted to the military school of Paris, Napoleone felt a shiver run through him. It was but a step, yet a monumental one. In Paris, he would join the beating heart of the kingdom, where officers destined to serve kings were trained. He, the child of Ajaccio, the son of a family without wealth, would walk the halls where great military careers were forged. Before leaving Brienne, he walked one last time through the cold corridors, the study rooms where he had stayed up entire nights, the icy courtyards where his snow armies had triumphed. In silence, he etched those years of trials, into his memory. Brienne had been his first battle, a war of endurance, and he emerged victorious. On the road to Paris, he thought of his father's voice, which had once told him, "Never bow your head, even before kings." Now he was preparing not only to avoid bowing, but to rise higher than all. Thus, in the icy solitude of French boarding schools, the spirit of the man who would soon be recognized as a master of war was forged. The cadet of Brienne was no longer an exiled child. He was becoming the nascent shadow of a future empire. Part 3. The Fire of Toulon. The year 1793 opened on a world in turmoil. The French Revolution, barely emerged from its initial convulsions, was threatened on all sides. The kings of Europe formed coalitions, provinces flared up, and France, faltering, fought for its survival. In this chaos, a Mediterranean port, Toulon, became the stage of a decisive struggle. Loyal to the Royalists, the city had surrendered its arsenal and harbor to the English and Spanish fleets. If Toulon remained in enemy hands, the Republic risked suffocation. It was in this context that a young artillery officer, still slight in stature, was sent to the scene. His name, barely known then, carried insular tones. Napoleon Bonaparte, son of Corsica, artillery captain. He was 24 years old with burning black eyes and an already strange assurance, as if every moment of his life was but a prelude to a grandeur still invisible. When he arrived before the walls of Toulon, the air was thick with gunpowder and salt. The sea breeze carried the scent of burnt pines, gutted powder magazines, and the cries of the wounded rose in waves, mingling with the roar of cannons. The coalition held the harbor with a formidable armada. English flags snapped above the ships, dark silhouettes standing against the sky. The siege dragged on, poorly led by hesitant generals. Napoleon, silent, observed. His eyes scanned the map, then the terrain. In an instant, he grasped what others had not seen. The keys to Toulon lay in two rocky promontories, Balaguier and Leguillet. Whoever controlled them would dominate the inner harbor and render the enemy fleet powerless. There, in the tumult of history, his military genius revealed itself for the first time. One evening, around a table lit by flickering candles, he presented his plan to the representatives on mission. His voice, deep but firm, resonated. "Citizens, it is not about striking blindly. Take Leguillet and Balaguier, and Toulon will fall like ripe fruit." The officers exchanged glances, some skeptical, others intrigued. But General de Gommier, more perceptive than his predecessors, nodded. "Captain Bonaparte, set up your batteries. The Republic follows you." Thus, in the icy night, the young Corsican moved his cannons forward. Soldiers dragged the heavy bronze barrels through the mud, their bleeding hands gripping the ropes. Napoleon, boots sunk in the clay, marched with them, adjusting a gun carriage, tracing a line, aiming a piece. His batteries took symbolic names: the Sans-Culottes, the Mountain, the Fearless Men. Each name vibrated like an invocation. The gunners, impressed by this officer who worked alongside them without sparing effort, began to follow him with fierce loyalty. Dawn rose over a harbor shrouded in mist. The enemy ships loomed, colossi of wood and canvas. Napoleon raised his hand, a signal, a flame, then the first salvo tore through the silence. Thunder rolled, cannonball struck the water, bursting into sprays of foam, then hit the English hulls. The enemy's counterfire followed immediately. The sky blazed with black smoke and flashes. In this symphony of iron and fire, Napoleon remained calm, guiding each shot with the precision of a geometer and the faith of a priest before the altar. The battle lasted days. His batteries, repositioned, reinforced, kept the enemy on edge. Every loss was compensated, every breach sealed. Soldiers recounted how the Corsican officer, his cloak whipped by the wind, often walked among the active guns, indifferent to the shrapnel fallen around him. One evening, a courier dared to say, "Captain, you expose yourself too much." He replied with a half-smile, "He who commands from behind does not command." Finally, the assault plan was set. Napoleon's batteries would pave the way, pulverizing the defenses of Balaguier and Leguiet. Then the infantry would charge. The night of the attack was dark, stirred by cold winds. The Republican columns advanced in silence, bayonets glinting in flashes under torchlight. In the trenches, the gunners awaited the signal, matches ready, sweat on their brows despite the frost. Napoleon raised his hand, then lowered his arm in a sharp gesture. Then the earth trembled. The cannons spat flames. The cannonballs struck the ramparts, opening breaches, toppling defenses. Covered by this deluge, the columns scaled the heights. Shouts, steel, smoke. The combat became fierce. In the heart of the melee, Napoleon received a wound to the thigh. Blood flowed into his boot, but he refused to leave the field. "It's nothing," he said. "The Republic does not bleed." At dawn, the promontories were taken. The Republican artillery now dominated the harbor. The English Admiral Hood, realizing the inevitable, gave the order to withdraw. The coalition, in their flight, set fire to the ships they could not take. The harbor turned into a blazing inferno, burning masts collapsing into the sea, red flames racing across the waves, explosions shaking the hills. The entire sky turned orange as if the apocalypse had chosen Toulon as its stage. Amid this inferno, Napoleon watched, motionless, his cloak soaked with rain and blood. His eyes followed the fall of the ships, and already he was thinking further ahead. His superiors congratulated him. General Dugommier solemnly said before all, "Citizen Bonaparte, Toulon belongs to the Republic, thanks to you." A few days later, the convention promoted him to brigadier general. At 24, he crossed a decisive threshold. Toulon was not just a military victory, it was the birth of a legend. In the silence of the following night, as the ruins still smoked, Napoleon wrote a few lines in his notebook. "Fire forges men as it forges metal. At Toulon, I felt the embrace of destiny. This is only a beginning." And as the waves gently lapped against the blackened quays, the name Bonaparte began to circulate in Paris as that of a man destined for greater things. The fire of Toulon had opened a breach, not only in the walls of a city, but in the very course of history. Plus Chapter 2, The Dawn of the Eagle. Part 1, The General of the Revolution. The fire of Toulon had thrust his name into Paris like lightning in a stormy night. In a few weeks, the young Corsican artillery captain, now a brigadier general, had gone from obscurity to prominence. But the revolution, unstable and ravenous, ceaselessly demanded new sacrifices. The borders were aflame. All of Europe formed a hostile belt, and France sought leaders capable of transforming defeat into victory. It was in this whirlwind that Napoleon Bonaparte would reveal for the first time the full scope of his strategic genius. In 1796, the Republic entrusted the young general with the command of the Army of Italy. It was not a glorious army. The soldiers, poorly clothed, malnourished, worn out by years of war, dragged their steps through the dust of the Alpine valleys. Many whispered that they were abandoned, condemned to a secondary war against the Austrians and their Piedmontese allies. Previous generals had hesitated, lacked boldness, and the men no longer believed in anything. It was into this despair that Bonaparte made his entrance. Slight, with long hair swept back, his uniform still unadorned, he did not cut an imposing figure, yet his dark, ardent, piercing eyes commanded attention. He mounted his horse before his assembled troops and addressed them with a few simple, unforgettable words. "Soldiers, you are naked, poorly fed. The government owes you much. It can give you nothing. But I will lead you to the most fertile plains in the world. There you will find honor, glory, and riches. Soldiers of Italy, I will lead you to victory." A silence at first. Then, like a rising wave, cheers erupted. "Long live the general! Long live Bonaparte!" The soldiers, galvanized, felt a spark of energy they thought long dead rekindle in their hearts. From the first weeks, Bonaparte transformed the campaign. With lightning speed, he divided his adversaries, striking them separately, surprising the Austrians and Piedmontese before they could unite. At Montenotte, his columns surged through rugged passes, attacking where no one expected. Cannonballs tore through the mist. The shouts of the assailants echoed against the rocky cliffs. Bonaparte, on his white horse, directed the movements with implacable precision. In a single day, he broke the enemy alliance. Then came Lode in May 1796. The bridge, narrow, spanned the Adda under the murderous fire of Austrian cannons. The soldiers hesitated. Crossing meant throwing themselves into death. Bonaparte understood the moment. He rushed forward himself, saber raised, leading his grenadiers. Under a hail of bullets, drums resounded, flags snapped, war cries drowned out the roar of explosions. The assault was of unparalleled savagery, and the Austrians, stunned by this irresistible surge, gave way. That evening, Bonaparte surveyed the battlefield strewn with bodies, the river carrying debris, and murmured to his aide-de-camp Berthier, "It was not I who won at Lodi. It was these men. But today I feel worthy of great things." This phrase, later recounted, marked a revelation. At Lodi, Napoleon had discovered in himself not only a war leader, but a man of destiny. The Italian campaign became an epic. At Arcole, he seized a flag and crossed a bridge under fire, galvanizing his troops with his audacity. At Rivoli, in January 1797, he displayed his tactical genius with absolute mastery, using the terrain, flanking maneuvers, concentrated artillery, until he enveloped the Austrian army. The mountains echoed with the roar of cannons and the cries of the besieged. Rivoli was the apotheosis. The Austrians, though superior in number, were crushed. Everywhere his name preceded him like a rumor. Italian peasants, watching his columns pass, whispered, "It's Bonaparte, the little Corsican general who topples empires." His own soldiers already called him the Little Corporal, an affectionate nickname born of his closeness to them, for he often ate with his men, sharing hard bread, sitting on a stone among them. This simplicity forged unwavering loyalty, but behind the military audacity, Bonaparte revealed another facet, that of a politician. In every conquered city, he proclaimed the freedom of the people, established sister republics, sowed the seeds of a new order. In Milan, he entered the cheers, elevated to the rank of a providential man. Bells rang, flags waved, and he advanced, solemn, his gaze fixed on the future. Yet in the solitude of bivouacs amid misty hills, he noted darker thoughts in his notebooks. Men are moved by two levers, fear and interest. Creating the illusion of glory is an art, but true power is founded on absolute obedience. He already knew that his victories were not merely military. They built a reputation, a legend that transcended borders. The leaders in Paris, sometimes wary of so much success concentrated in one man's hands, now regarded him as a new, difficult-to-contain force. When the campaign ended, after the signing of the Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797, the map of Europe was transformed. The French Republic, thanks to Bonaparte's victories, had extended its influence to the heart of Italy. Venice's treasures were sent to Paris. Italy's fertile plains fed France, and Napoleon's name resounded in every European court like that of a meteor. Upon his return, his soldiers, exhausted but exhilarated, hailed him as a hero. Crowds pressed around him, waving flags, shouting his name. In their eyes, he was no longer just a general of the revolution. He was becoming a man chosen by history. One evening, on the banks of the Po, as the dark waters flowed under the starlight, Napoleon remained alone, pensive. The wind lifted the edges of his cloak, and in the murmur of the river, he thought he heard an inner voice repeating, "This is only the beginning." Part 2. The Egypt of the Pharaohs. After the triumphs in Italy, Bonaparte's name resounded like thunder. Paris acclaimed him, but Paris also watched him with unease. Too many victories, too much glory concentrated in one man. The fragile republic feared he might become a Caesar. So, to distance this meteor while still using him, the Directory decided to send him to the east. England, mistress of the seas, had to be struck at its interests. Egypt, the gateway to the routes to India, became the target. In May 1798, a vast fleet set sail from Toulon. Hundreds of sails billowed in the wind, carrying not only an army of soldiers, but also a cohort of scholars, engineers, and artists. For Napoleon dreamed not only of military conquests, he wanted an expedition that would marry war and science, the sword and knowledge. On the deck at night, under a sky studded with stars, he spoke to the scholars of Ptolemy, Alexander, the grandeur of vanished civilizations. In his words, his officers already heard the echo of a destiny that surpassed France itself. On July 1st, the white sails appeared off the scorching coast. Egypt lay before them, vast and silent. The soldiers disembarked at Alexandria, crushed by the sun, their boots sinking into the sand. The light was so harsh it seemed to cut the contours of things. The air carried an unfamiliar scent, a mix of dust, dried dates, and desert wind. To many, this land seemed unreal, almost biblical. From the first days, Bonaparte struck with his adaptability. In a proclamation addressed to the Egyptians, translated into Arabic, he wrote, People of Egypt, you will be told I come to destroy your religion. This is a lie. I come to restore your rights, to punish your oppressors. I respect Mohammed, the Prophet, and the Koran more than the Mamluks who enslave you. Thus, through words, he sought to present himself as a liberator, blending politics and strategy with consummate skill. But the Mamluks, fierce cavalry, awaited him. On July 21st, 1798, near the banks of the Nile, one of the most famous battles in history took shape, the Battle of the Pyramids. The heat was oppressive, the sand blinding. On the horizon, the colossal silhouettes of the Giza pyramids seemed to watch over the men like immemorial specters. Before them, thousands of Mamluk cavalry, curved sabers glinting in the sun, excited horses neighing, war cries resounding in the scorching air. The French army, exhausted by the march, rallied around its leader. Bonaparte, his gaze steady, raised his saber and said, "Soldiers, think that from the top of these monuments 40 centuries are watching you." These words, forever etched in collective memory, electrified the ranks. The French squares formed, compact masses, bristling with bayonets and cannons. The Mamluks, furious, charged like a sandstorm. The ground shook under the hooves, the cries pierced the burning air, but the squares held firm. The cannons spat fire, the volleys mowed down the cavalry crashing against this wall of steel. The battle was brief but terrible. The Nile, tinged with blood, reflected the fall of an ancient world before modern discipline. At dusk, silence returned over the fields strewn with bodies and horses. The pyramids, immutable, seemed to approve or condemn, no one could say. Bonaparte, standing in the fading light, contemplated the scene. His eyes shone with a singular glow. He had not only won a military victory, he had sealed an encounter between two eras, two civilizations. Yet, fate soon turned cruel. A month later, in August, the French fleet, anchored in Aboukir Bay, was surprised and destroyed by Admiral Nelson. The explosion of ships lit up the night, and the Mediterranean closed like a trap. Cut off from France, the French army found itself isolated in the desert. The soldiers, overwhelmed by heat, disease, and deprivation, began to murmur. Bonaparte, however, refused to yield. He led his troops further toward Syria, attempting to break the tightening circle. But at Saint-Jean d'Acre, the walls held firm. Cannons thundered day and night. Assaults faltered. Diseases decimated the ranks. The glory of the pyramids crumbled in the dust of an endless siege. It was in these dark hours that the man's endurance shone through. Often he was seen walking among the sick, visiting hospitals, touching the plague-stricken without fear, as if to show that even death could not touch him. This gesture, reported and amplified, became legendary. The image of a general sharing his men's suffering, defying fate with almost supernatural courage. Finally, he understood that fortune was turning. Without a fleet, without reinforcements, surrounded by too many enemies, he decided to return to France. In August 1799, he left Alexandria in secret, leaving his army behind. On the ship's deck, he looked one last time at Egypt's coast, fading into the mist. His thoughts were heavy. He had not conquered the East like Alexander, but he had touched the world's imagination. As the sails vanished on the horizon, he murmured almost to himself, "I have sown seeds in Egypt that will not die." And indeed the scholars he had brought would reveal unsuspected treasures to the world. Hieroglyphs monuments, maps, surveys. The military expedition ended in failure, but the scientific expedition opened a new field. Bonaparte, for his part, returned to France, determined to turn his oriental glory into a political springboard. In the silence of Mediterranean nights, the ship's rocking barely lulled him to sleep, but in his mind echoed the voice of the pyramids, ancient, deep, infinite. You have passed, and we have seen you. Part 3. The 18 Brumaire. The autumn of 1799 cloaked Paris in thick mists. In the streets, carts creaked, footsteps sank into the mud, and faces remained closed. 10 years after the monarchy's fall, the Republic seemed exhausted, gasping, torn between rival factions, plots, and the people's weariness. The Directory, undermined by corruption and impotence, held on only by habit. Many sensed that a radical change was coming. It was in this climate of uncertainty that Bonaparte returned from Egypt. His landing in France was greeted like a resurrection. Despite the military failure, his legend had grown. Newspapers spoke of the victor of the pyramids, the man who had defied the Mamluks and resisted the East. Wherever he passed, crowds gathered, cheering his name. But behind the popular enthusiasm lay a colder resolve to seize power. In Parisian salons, conspiracies intertwined. Sieyès, one of the directors, an ambitious but armyless intellectual, sought a sword to carry out his reform project. He found in Napoleon the ideal weapon. The two men met in a room lit by the flickering flame of a fireplace. Sieyès, thin and austere, outlined his plan. The Republic is sick. We must destroy it to save it. You, General, will be the executor of this necessity. Bonaparte, seated in the shadows, his hand resting on his cane, replied in a low voice, I am not an instrument. I am the one who acts. The pact was sealed. The coup d'etat would take place. On November 9th, 1799 or 18th, Brumaire year 8 in the revolutionary calendar, Paris awoke to unusual sounds at dawn. The clatter of hooves, the clink of weapons, the measured steps of troops. Bonaparte, in uniform, rode through the city on horseback, surrounded by loyal grenadiers. The people, intrigued, pressed to the windows. Some cheered, others remained silent, but all felt that this day would be unlike any other. The Council of 500 was summoned to Saint-Cloud, far from Parisian tumult. In the palace gardens, bare trees shivered in the cold wind. The deputies, in dark frock coats, entered with nervous steps, unaware they were about to witness the end of a regime. Bonaparte, accompanied by his brothers and officers, entered the hall. All eyes turned to him at once. He spoke, awkwardly at first, evoking the need for change, the exhaustion of the Directory, the necessity of salvation. But the deputies, far from being persuaded, erupted against him. Shouts rang out, "Outlaw! Dictator! Tyrant!" Tension mounted. Bonaparte, pale, faltered under the clamor. For a moment, he seemed to waver. His enemies thought victory was theirs. But at that moment, his brother Lucien, president of the Assembly, intervened with fierce energy. Brandishing his sword, he cried, "I swear I will strike my brother with this blade if he betrays the Republic, but I also swear we will not yield to the factious who wish to deliver France to chaos." The hall exploded into chaos. Deputies pounded desks, shouted, gesticulated. In this turmoil, Murat's grenadiers entered, sabers drawn. The representatives, seized with panic, scattered. Some jumped through windows, others fled, dropping their papers. It was the end of the Directory, swept away not by debate but by steel and fear. In the icy night, Saint-Cloud gradually quieted. Bonaparte, silent, stood in a salon with dark draperies. Around him, Sieyès, Ducos, and a few others were already preparing the new constitution. But no one doubted that the true master was now the Corsican general. A few days later, the consulate was proclaimed. 3 consuls were to share power. Sieyès had hoped to govern from the shadows. But very quickly, Bonaparte imposed himself as the first. His gestures, his words, his natural authority overshadowed his colleagues. The eyes of the people, soldiers, and administrators turned to him. Paris, weary of uncertainties, welcomed this new power as a deliverance. In the privacy of his office, Bonaparte drafted the first foundational texts, outlining a regime that resembled him, centralized, energetic, authoritarian. He worked entire nights, bent over maps, reports, laws. His entourage saw him write with a swift hand, tirelessly, as if driven by an inner force greater than himself. One evening, his brother Joseph asked him, "Do you realize, Napoleon, that you have ended the revolution?" The future emperor, his gaze distant, replied, "No, I haven't ended it. I have directed it. The revolution is no longer chaos. It is becoming an order. And that order is me." Thus ended the 18 Brumaire. In the shadow of autumn mists, one regime had collapsed, and another was born. The Republic, bled dry, found a master. The people, tired, found a guide. And history, inexorable, found in Napoleon Bonaparte a new face. In the corridors of Saint-Cloud, silence fell after the tumult. But for those who could hear, a new sound began to resonate, the step of the eagle rising, ready to dominate Europe's skies. Chapter 3. The Empire of Destinies. Part 1. The Coronation of the Emperor. On December 6, 1804, Paris awoke under a mantle of winter. The Seine rolled its gray waters slowly, and the bells, deep and solemn, resounded above the frost-covered rooftops. In the streets, despite the biting cold, crowds gathered. Tricolor flags fluttered, mingled with banners bearing golden bees, the new emblem of a power that sought to be both ancient and eternal. The air vibrated with an almost sacred tension. That day, a son of Corsica, once a solitary child in Brienne and an obscure captain in Toulon, would cross the threshold of destiny. Napoleon Bonaparte would become Napoleon I, Emperor of the French. The Cathedral of Notre-Dame de Paris, adorned with tapestries and draperies, shone resplendently. Inside, candles illuminated the Gothic columns, casting dancing shadows on the ancient vaults. The scent of wax, resin, and incense filled the air, lending the place an atmosphere both solemn and mystical. Foreign sovereigns, princes, dignitaries, marshals, all waited in a silence heavy with gravity. Velvet cloaks, gold-embroidered uniforms, plumes, and swords formed a shimmering sea. Pope Pius VII himself, come from Rome despite his reservations, stood ready, a white and motionless figure, his face grave. Then the trumpet sounded. In a murmur that became a clamor, the assembly turned. Napoleon entered. He wore a purple velvet mantle strewn with golden bees, trailing behind him like an imperial cape. On his shoulders rested a heavy ermine cloak. His measured, imposing stride was already that of a sovereign greater than kings. At his side, Josephine, radiant in her white and gold gown, advanced with trembling grace, aware that this day marked the pinnacle of her life. The organs resounded, filling the nave with a powerful, almost celestial rumble. Napoleon advanced toward the altar before the improvised throne. The Pope raised his hands, ready to perform the ancient rite of coronation. All held their breath. The scene seemed fixed by destiny. The church was about to place its blessing on the brow of the man from Corsica. But then, in a sudden, unexpected gesture, Napoleon took the crown in his own hands. A stunned silence swept through the assembly. He raised it high slowly, as if defying the heavens themselves. Then, with a firm movement, he placed it on his own head. This bold, symbolic gesture reverberated like a thunderclap in history. Napoleon crowned himself. He declared before the entire world that his power came neither from the Pope, nor the Church, nor any higher authority. It came from himself alone, from his will, his strength, his destiny. The nave, frozen for a moment, filled with a murmur. Then the acclamation erupted. "Long live the Emperor! Long live Napoleon Bonaparte!" After crowning Josephine with an almost tender delicacy, Napoleon turned to the assembly. His gaze swept over the Gothic arches, the grave faces of the marshals, the intimidated nobles, the foreign diplomats. In his eyes shone a burning conviction. He was no longer merely a general of the revolution. He was becoming the founder of a new order, the master of an empire. The Pope, despite his sidelining, continued the ceremony, blessing the Emperor and Empress. But everyone knew the essential had already transpired. With this gesture, Napoleon had proclaimed his independence from all spiritual authority. Like Charlemagne before him, he placed himself in the lineage of sovereigns who forged their own crowns. Outside, cannons roared from the Invalides, rolling through the icy air like prolonged thunder. Paris trembled under this din, and the crowds, massed along the streets, cheered, drunk with enthusiasm. The echoes resounded to the outskirts, as if the entire city became the stage of a vast theater where history wrote an immortal scene. In the silence that returned to the nave, Napoleon took his place on the throne, scepter in hand, purple mantle spread out. His profile stood out in the candlelight, like that of a resurrected Roman emperor. Courtiers whispered some saw in him a modern Caesar, others a reborn Alexander, but all felt that this day marked an irreversible turning point. Josephine, at his side, her eyes misty, gazed at the man who had raised her to the highest dignity, but whose insatiable ambition she already sensed. Pius VII, meanwhile, remained silent, resigned. He knew the church had lost a symbolic battle. When the ceremony ended, Napoleon rose, crossing the nave amid cheers. The December cold swept into the cathedral as the heavy doors opened, and the emperor stepped into the pale daylight. Horses pawed the ground, soldiers presented arms, drums beat. The people, massed along the quays and squares, shouted his name until exhaustion. That evening, Paris glowed with 1,000 lights. Illuminations ran across facades, music rose, and toasts multiplied in salons. But in the privacy of his study, Napoleon remained pensive. Before him on the table rested the crown. He gazed at it for a long time, then, placing his hand upon it, murmured, I have taken the diadem, but it is not to keep it still. It is to raise it, and perhaps to break it if I falter. Thus ended the coronation, not a mere religious ceremony, but a founding act, a silent proclamation to all of Europe. A new empire was rising, and in the cold of that December, history, attentive, held its breath. Part 2. The Master of Europe. The coronation at Notre Dame was not an end, but a beginning. As soon as the golden crown rested on his brow, Napoleon turned again to the battlefield, where, more than in cathedrals, his legitimacy was written. The empire was not yet secure. It had to be conquered by iron and fire. In 1805, Europe rose again. England, Russia, Austria formed a formidable coalition. Diplomats, in the shadows of palaces, swore to bring down the Corsican eagle before he spread his wings over the entire continent. War drums resounded across borders, and armies were already on the march. Napoleon, master of Paris, launched himself without hesitation. He called upon the Grande Armée, that force born of the Revolution, tempered by the Italian campaigns, strengthened by the New Order. Over 200,000 men clad in blue uniforms, aligned under hundreds of flags, answered his call. The plains of Champagne and Burgundy filled with the sound of drums, the neighing of horses, the clink of sabers. The march eastward was swift, relentless. The soldiers, despite their fatigue, felt carried by their leader's presence. It was said that in bivouacs, Napoleon approached the fires, sat with them, shared a ration of bread or soup. His simple words, his ardent gaze, instilled unshakable confidence. On December 2nd, 1805, exactly 1 year after his coronation, the emperor met his enemies near a small Moravian village, Austerlitz. The morning of the battle, a thick fog covered the hills. The frozen ground crunched under the soldiers' steps. Napoleon, on horseback, surveyed the terrain with a jeweler's precision. He had deliberately weakened his center, luring the enemy into an invisible trap. Around him, his marshals awaited his orders. Gentlemen, observe this sun well. You are about to see the sun of Austerlitz shine. At these words, the veil of mist parted, letting a radiant light pierce through. Golden rays spread over the hills like a sign from the heavens. The soldiers, galvanized, took up in chorus, "Long live the Emperor!" The battle began. The Russians and Austrians, believing they had found a weakness, rushed to the center. But it was a ruse. The French divisions, disciplined, held them while Davout and Soult's columns enveloped the flanks. Cannons roared, shaking the frozen earth. Bayonets gleamed in the winter light. With every movement, Napoleon seemed to read the living map of the battle, adjusting, correcting, striking where the enemy broke. By noon, the enemy center collapsed. The coalition, caught in a vice, was crushed. The ice of nearby ponds gave way under the fleeing troops, swallowing men and horses into the freezing waters. This terrible spectacle marked memories. Austerlitz was not just a victory, it was a cataclysm. That evening, Napoleon walked the field strewn with bodies, the soldiers' torches casting light on frozen faces. To his assembled officers he said in a grave voice, "Soldiers, I am pleased with you. You have adorned your eagle with immortal glory." The sun of Austerlitz became a symbol. All of Europe trembled. Austria was forced to sign the Peace of Pressburg, Russia retreated. England remained alone on its island. But Napoleon did not stop. The following years were marked by a series of dazzling victories. Jena and Auerstedt in 1806, where Prussia, once feared, was crushed in a single day. Friedland in 1807, where the Russians were forced to the Peace of Tilsit. Each battle was a theater where the eagle spread its wings. Cannons roared, sabers clashed, and always in the dust and smoke, Napoleon's silhouette appeared, impassive, guiding the lightning. His marshals, Ney, Lannes, Murat, Davout, became the heroes of an epic. His soldiers, proud of their leader, followed him with blind loyalty. In Europe's capitals, thrones wavered. Kings signed humiliating treaties, ceded provinces, paid indemnities. The French Empire stretched from Madrid to Warsaw, from Hamburg to Rome. In Paris, victories were celebrated with improvised triumphal arches, illuminations, and popular festivities. Crowds cheered the emperor, seeing in him the incarnation of France's power and glory. But amid this tumult of triumphs, some already sensed unease. Too many victories, too much pride, too many subdued peoples. One day, the wheel of fortune would turn. One evening, after the Peace of Tilsit, Napoleon stood alone on the banks of the Niemen. The river reflected the light of torches and stars. He murmured, as if to himself, "I have tamed Europe, but how long can a man hold the world in his hand?" The summer breeze stirred the water's surface like a silent reply. The eagle flew high, perhaps too high, but for now all of Europe bowed before him. Napoleon, son of Corsica, general of the Revolution, had become the master of Europe. Part 3. The Code and the Crown. The glory of the battlefields filled Europe, but Napoleon knew that military victories alone could not sustain a lasting empire. The sword conquers, but the law consolidates. After Austerlitz, Jena, and Tilsit, while his marshals drafted battle reports and diplomats signed treaties, the emperor devoted himself to another, quieter, but perhaps more profound work: reforming France. Each morning, in his study at the Tuileries or Saint-Cloud, gray light filtered through tall windows. Napoleon, already awake before dawn, worked tirelessly. Piles of files stacked on his desk, administrators' reports, draft laws, petitions from every province. He skimmed everything with a swift eye, annotating in a nervous script, drawing vigorous strokes. His secretary struggled to keep up with the frenetic pace of his thought. His most striking obsession was the creation of a coherent legal framework. The Revolution had abolished old laws, but left a chaos of contradictory regulations. Napoleon wanted to give France a clear, universal civil code that would outlast regimes and generations. He gathered jurists, magistrates, seasoned legal scholars around him. In the Council of State Chamber, he presided over debates, listening, interrupting, dictating his views with a strategist's precision. Laws must be short, clear, understandable to all. They are not riddles for scholars, they are rules for the people. The jurists bowed, sometimes forced to abandon subtleties, sometimes impressed by the leader's acumen. The Civil Code, completed in 1804 but refined over years, soon became the Napoleonic Code. It guaranteed equality before the law, protected property, organized marriage, filiation, and contracts. For some, it was the true foundation of his empire, a written, solid, transmissible order. Beyond the law, Napoleon restructured the state. He created prefects, veritable proconsuls tasked with governing each department in the emperor's name. He reformed finances, founded the Bank of France, ensured currency stability. Lycées, modern institutions, shaped a generation of students trained in discipline and science. The Legion of Honor, established in 1802, rewarded civil and military merits, offering recognition to the humble that had once belonged only to nobles. In Paris, the very stones seemed to change under his impetus. Triumphal arches were planned, roads laid out, bridges thrown across the Seine. New avenues symbolized order and grandeur. In the provinces, mayors, judges, and administrators felt supported by a strong central state. For the first time in centuries, France breathed a real unity. But the emperor did not forget pomp, for power needs symbols. At the Tuileries, Fontainebleau, Compiègne, the imperial court took shape. Balls, ceremonies, and audiences followed one another in a blaze of gold and velvet. Josephine, crowned, reigned with elegance, surrounded by richly dressed ladies. The marshals, in ornate uniforms, formed a new nobility, that of the brave, rewarded with titles, duchies, and conquered lands. One evening, during a reception at Saint-Cloud, Napoleon observed the world he had shaped. Chandeliers cast their glow on mirrors, violins played minuets. Conversations buzzed with ambition and intrigue. To his entourage, he said, almost pensive, "I have replaced the old aristocracy with another, but at least this one earned its stripes under cannon fire." This phrase revealed the dual nature of his work: reform and splendor, law and glory, code and crown. He consolidated the state while building a dynasty. For deep within him, a concern lingered, the lack of an heir. Josephine, despite her affection and place in his heart, could not give him a child. Rumors already circulated that he might one day repudiate the empress to secure his lineage. Yet, despite these shadows, the work seemed solid. Europe's courts envied this administrative machine that functioned with fearsome precision. Conquered peoples, even reluctant, often adopted Napoleonic reforms. The civil code crossed borders, prefects inspired foreign systems, centralization became a model. But in the silence of his working nights, bent over his papers, Napoleon sensed weariness. Wars always called him. Peace seemed a mirage. His reforms, he knew, would only hold value if they withstood the tumult of arms. One evening, as he dictated legal articles, his secretary Brienne asked, "Sire, do you believe this code will live long?" Napoleon raised his eyes, his dark gaze lighting up for a moment. "My victories may fade, but this code will outlast my battles." This prophecy, spoken in the shadow of a study, proved true. For if the cannons of Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram would one day fall silent, the Napoleonic code would endure, carried through the centuries, applied far beyond France. Thus, at the heart of his empire, Napoleon was not only the flamboyant strategist of battlefields, he was also the legislator, the architect of a new order. Between the sound of drums and the silence of offices, between spilled blood and black ink, he built a dual legacy, that of a conqueror and that of a founder. And in this contrast, perhaps, lay Napoleon's true greatness, the man who donned the crown but also carve the law. Chapter 4. The Shadow of Winter. Part 1. The Shaken Empire. After the triumphs, after the order of laws and the splendor of crowns, came the time of cracks. The empire immense seemed invincible, but already beneath its foundations, tremors were mounting. Like a wall built too quickly, it would soon crack under its own contradictions. By the turn of 1808, a wind of unease blew across Europe. In Paris, imperial ceremonies still shone with splendor, but in the weary countryside, families murmured against conscriptions and taxes. Everywhere, the endless war weighed heavily. The thrones Napoleon had toppled were rising in the shadows, and the nations he thought subdued began to stir. The first crack opened in the south, Spain. In 1808, under the pretext of arbitrating the Bourbon dynasty's disputes, Napoleon sent his troops across the Pyrenees. Madrid was occupied. King Charles IV forced to abdicate, and on Spain's throne, the emperor placed his brother Joseph. But this political calculation quickly turned into a bloody trap. In the narrow streets of Madrid, the inhabitants rose up. On May 2nd, 1808, the Spanish capital erupted. Madrilenians, armed with knives, stones, and sticks, threw themselves at the French soldiers. Shouts echoed between white walls, horses panicked, rifles thundered. The French repressed the revolt with ruthless brutality. Shootings, summary executions, bodies piled against walls. All of Europe shuddered at these scenes, later immortalized by Goya's brush. But far from dying out, the revolt spread to the countryside. In the mountains, guerrillas organized. These men of the people, peasants, artisans, sometimes priests, harassed convoys, ambushed stragglers, struck and vanished. Napoleon's soldiers, trained for pitched battles, found themselves powerless against this shadow war. Every path became an ambush, every hill a hideout. Napoleon had to intervene himself, crossing Spain at the head of the Grande Armée. His victories were dazzling. Burgos, Madrid retaken, the Spanish scattered, but each battle won only fueled hatred. Spain became a quagmire, swallowing thousands of men. The emperor, who thought he could subdue this kingdom with a snap of his fingers, faced a fierce resistance fed by faith, land, and blood. And as if this front were not enough, another shadow rose. In the north, England, made mistress of the seas by Trafalgar, supported the insurgents. The Duke of Wellington landed in Portugal, and soon British battalions, solid and disciplined, joined the war. Spain became a morass, an open wound that would bleed the empire for years. Napoleon, in his reports, remained confident. But in the intimacy of his letters sometimes an unease slipped through. This cursed Spanish war devours me like an ulcer. Meanwhile, elsewhere, other cracks appeared. In Germany, Italy, Poland, conquered peoples increasingly resented the French yoke. The kings Napoleon had placed on thrones, his brothers, brothers-in-law, marshals, often governed clumsily, stirring resentment and humiliation. The empire, too vast, began to lack foundations. And yet, Napoleon pressed on. He believed force was enough, that victories would extinguish the fires. But his enemies were learning. England funded, Russia distrusted, Austria bided its time. All of Europe, wounded and humiliated, watched for the crack to strike. One winter evening at Fontainebleau, the emperor gazed alone at the firelight in the hearth. Fatigue marked his features, but his mind remained taut. He murmured, like a confession no one heard, "Have I built an empire too quickly? Or is it the world that insists on remaining old?" Around him, marshals stirred, diplomats drafted treaties, spies brought rumors, but none dared tell him what all felt. The empire, so vast, was beginning to waver. In Spain's plains, French columns continued to march, lost in dust and blood. In the salons of Vienna, London, and St. Petersburg, new alliances were whispered, and in the heart of Paris, despite the lights of balls and processions, a cold breath already passed, heralding the winter to come. The eagle still flew high, but its wings, weighed down by too many conquests, were tiring. And in the shadow of Spain's mountains, one could almost hear an omen. The time of triumphs was ending. Part 2. Moscow in Flames. The year 1812 opened on an immense, for some insane, but for him necessary decision. Napoleon would strike Russia. The alliance forged with Tsar Alexander at Tilsit was but a memory. Russia, to find the continental blockade against England, threatened the empire's entire edifice. For Napoleon, action was imperative. But action meant launching his army into the heart of a vast, hostile, unknown land. In June, the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen. Never had the world seen such a force. Over 600,000 men from every nation under the empire marched under imperial eagles. French, Poles, Italians, Dutch, Germans, Croats. A Babel in arms, a human and metallic tide that made Europe tremble. The sound of their steps drowned out birdsong. Their drums resounded like thunderclaps. At first, the advance was almost triumphal. Vast plains opened, villages emptied before their arrival. But reality soon imposed itself. The summer heat oppressed. Dusty roads stretched endlessly. Convoys grew heavy. The Russians, instead of engaging, retreated ceaselessly, burning their crops, torching their barns, leaving a black and barren land. The scorched earth strategy fell like a curse. The further the army advanced, the deeper it sank into a void. In September, the Russians finally gave battle at Borodino. Dawn rose over a misty plain, bristling with redoubts, cannons, trenches. The two armies, over 1 million men combined, faced each other in a terrible silence. Napoleon, ill, feverish, surveyed the battlefield from a mound. His marshals surrounded him, awaiting his order. "The victory will be bloody, but it will be ours," he said in a low voice. The bombardment began. Salvos shook the earth. Cannonballs plowed through ranks. The cries of the wounded mingled with the din. All day hell roared. Infantry charges, cavalry assaults, Russian counterattacks followed one another. The ground, soaked with blood, became a reddish mire. At nightfall, the Russian army, decimated, withdrew. The victory was French, but at the cost of a slaughter. 50,000 dead littered the silent plain. Days later, the French army reached Moscow. The exhausted soldiers discovered the holy city, the beating heart of Russia. Golden domes gleamed in the sun, bells rang, and a sense of triumph spread. But this triumph was a mirage, for Moscow, nearly empty, was about to deliver to Napoleon a vision of apocalypse. On the night of September 14th, ominous glows rose, first a few isolated flames, then wider conflagrations. Soon, entire districts blazed. The wind fanned the fire, and Moscow became an inferno. Roofs collapsed, steeples fell, torrents of sparks rose to the sky. The entire city, set ablaze by order of Governor Rostopchin, consumed itself before the emperor's eyes. Napoleon, installed in the Kremlin, watched the flames from a window. Red reflections danced on his pale face. He murmured, "What a terrifying tragedy! These barbarians prefer to burn their capital than surrender it." The fire raged for days. When it finally died out, Moscow was but a charred skeleton. No food, no shelter, no peace. Tsar Alexander refused to negotiate. Napoleon waited, hoped for a sign. Nothing came. Autumn advanced, nights grew cold, and already the first snowflakes fell. In October, he made the fatal decision: retreat. It was a descent into hell. The French columns, laden with useless plunder, harassed by Cossacks, stretched across frozen plains. Snow fell endlessly. The wind bit flesh. Horses collapsed. Men marched like specters. Many discarded their weapons. Some died sitting in the snow, unable to rise. At the Berezina in November, the army attempted to cross the icy river. Under Russian fire, French sappers, heroic, threw up makeshift bridges. Thousands crossed, but thousands perished in the freezing waters. The river carried away screams, bodies, and part of the empire's destiny. When Napoleon finally abandoned this hellish retreat to rush back to Paris, only a shadow of the Grande Armée remained. Of over 600,000 men who had set out from the west, fewer than a tenth returned. In the frozen silence of a winter night, in an improvised ISBA headquarters, Napoleon wrote a few words. "From the sublime to the tragic, there is but a step. Fortune has abandoned me, but I have not abandoned it." Moscow in the flames was not just a terrible image, it was an omen. The empire, too vast, too proud, had met the eternal winter. Part 3. Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations. The Russian winter had shattered the illusion of invincibility. Of the Grande Armée, proud and innumerable, only a shadow remained. Haggard survivors recounting endless snows, frozen corpses. The Berezina turned liquid tomb. Yet in Paris, Napoleon refused to yield. His enemies thought the eagle failed, but he unleashed superhuman energy. In months, he raised new troops, equipped regiments, trained young conscripts dubbed Marie-Louises, frail boys sent too soon to war. The empire, like a volcano, still produced armies. But across from him, all of Europe rose. Russia, Austria, Prussia, England, Sweden, a vast coalition uniting more nations than any conflict had ever seen. Sovereigns, bound by fear and hatred, swore to bring down the man who had dictated Europe's law. The year 1813 was a long struggle. Napoleon, despite his diminished forces, still won dazzling victories. Lutzen, Bautzen, where his rapid maneuvers briefly suggested his genius remained intact. But losses mounted, and his young recruits, brave but inexperienced, tired quickly. Slowly, the circle tightened. In October, near the city of Leipzig, in Saxony, destinies met. There, on plains crossed by rivers and marshes, the greatest battle of the era would unfold, soon called the Battle of the Nations. On the morning of October 16th, a damp fog covered the fields. Over 600,000 men were gathered, French, Poles, Italians, Saxons on one side, Russians, Prussians, Austrians, Swedes on the other. Never had Europe seen such a concentration of forces. Villages, hills, Waterways would become a theater of fire. Napoleon, positioned on a height, surveyed the plain. His marshals surrounded him, anxious. He knew the task was nearly impossible. His forces were outnumbered, his allies uncertain. But his gaze remained hard, burning. "Gentlemen, we will fight as if we were alone against the entire world." The battle erupted. Cannons roared, shaking the earth with a continuous tremor. Clouds of smoke rose, enveloping the hills. French columns surged forward, bayonets gleaming, drums beating. Cavalry charges resounded like storms of hooves. But each attack met a wall of steel. The Russians held their ground. The Prussians advanced relentlessly. The Austrians struck the flanks. The fighting lasted days. Villages changed hands multiple times in a single day. Houses burned. Churches collapsed. Rivers carried swollen corpses. The cries of the dying mingled with the ceaseless roar of cannons. The young French recruits fell by the thousands, cut down by the experience of enemy veterans. On October 18th, the tide turned. The Saxons, until then Napoleon's allies, betrayed him mid-battle. Their cannons suddenly pivoted, firing on the French they had stood beside the day before. It was a brutal betrayal, a blow to the heart of the imperial army. Dismay spread, lines broke. Napoleon tried to maintain order, rushing to every faltering point of the battle. On horseback, a dark silhouette in the smoke, he encouraged, commanded, galvanized. His officers saw him expose himself relentlessly, as if he believed his mere presence could still turn the tide, but the enemy ocean was too vast. On October 19th, retreat was decided. The bridges over the Elster were to allow escape. The exhausted French columns crossed in growing disorder. But at the critical moment, an explosion rang out. A bridge blew up prematurely, cutting off the retreat. Thousands of men remained trapped on the other side, surrounded, doomed. Cries of despair echoed, drowned by smoke and noise. Napoleon, grim, crossed the river just in time. He knew the empire had received a near-fatal blow. Leipzig was not just a defeat. It was the end of an illusion. Europe, united, had succeeded in breaking the eagle. That evening, in a ruined house turned headquarters, he remained silent for a long time. His marshals awaited a word. Finally, he said in a low voice, "It is too early to die. France still lives, and I live with her." But deep down, he felt the truth. The empire was shaken to its roots. The roads to Paris now lay open to enemy armies. In the icy fog of the Saxon autumn, crows circled above fields strewn with bodies. Leipzig, the battle of the nations, ended, and Europe, momentarily freed from Napoleon's yoke, prepared to march on France. Chapter 5. The Island and Eternity. Part 1. The Eagle in Exile. On April 6, 1814, in the cold hall of the Château de Fontainebleau, Napoleon signed his abdication. His hand, which had led armies and reshaped Europe, trembled for a moment as it traced his name. The marshals, gathered around him, lowered their heads. Some, ashamed, could not meet his gaze. The empire collapsed, and with it the dream of universal glory. Days later, dressed in a simple gray coat, the fallen emperor left France under escort. His destiny sent him to a small Mediterranean island, Elba, of which he became, by cruel irony, the sovereign. From the vastness of Europe, from Russia's plains to Spain's hills, he was reduced to a rock of 224 square kilometers. The eagle, king of battles, found himself caged. The journey was long, at times humiliating. In the villages he passed, some wept, others insulted him. But Napoleon kept his face impassive. His dark eyes still burned as if the flame refused to die. When he finally saw Elba, he gazed at its dark mountains plunging into the blue sea, its tiny ports, its olive-covered hills. A bitter smile crossed his lips. Here I am, emperor of a pebble. At Portoferraio, the small capital, he settled in a modest palace. But true to himself, he immediately set to work. He reorganized the administration, built roads, revived mines, developed the navy. Elba, until then slumbering, suddenly buzzed with new energy. Its inhabitants, surprised, saw this exiled sovereign act with the same fervor as if he still governed a continent. Each morning he rode across the hills, observing the sea, the wind lifting his gray coat. From there he sometimes glimpsed the sails of foreign ships on the horizon, and in his heart surged a certainty. Europe, which thought it had neutralized him, had forgotten that the eagle, even caged, still dreams of the sky. Days passed, marked by visits, reports, projects. But the quieter nights revealed another truth. In his narrow room, lit by an oil lamp, Napoleon reread his campaigns, reviewed maps, scribbled notes. Sometimes he rose abruptly, as if still hearing the roll of drums, the roar of cannons. Then he sank back into his chair, murmuring, "Was I master of the world, or fortune's plaything?" His few companions shared his exile. General Bertrand, loyal to the end. Marshal Drouot, upright and silent, a handful of servants. They saw their master oscillate between energy and melancholy, between feverish projects and heavy silences. One day, Bertrand dared to say, "Sire, you are greater than your fate. Europe cannot forget you." Napoleon, his gaze lost toward the sea, replied, "Europe will forget me faster than a man dries a tear, but France bears my mark." Yet beyond Elba's hills, France was simmering. King Louis XVI, restored to the throne, struggled to impose himself. The people murmured, the army longed for its former leader, veterans scattered in garrisons still spoke of past glories, the sons of Austerlitz, the triumphal marches. In villages whispers spread, if the emperor returned. And Napoleon from his island heard these echoes. Letters, rumors, discreet messengers brought word that France was not at peace. Slowly, a project took shape in his mind. At first, a mere thought, then an obsession, to return. On winter evenings, he gazed at the restless sea, his eyes fixed northward. Waves crashed against rocks like drums, and the wind howled like a distant bugle. He closed his eyes and saw himself landing on a French beach, greeted by soldiers who, instead of fighting him, rallied to him. In his dreams, he heard the cheers, "Long live the Emperor!" One day, as he walked the coast with Bertrand, he stopped abruptly, pointed to the horizon, and said, "There, beyond the waves, my throne still awaits me. They think they've banished me, but I am still the Emperor. I have not said my last word." Thus, on this tiny island, history was about to shift again. The chained eagle was already beating its wings in the shadows. Europe, believing it had found peace, did not yet know that a storm was brewing. For on Elba, under the Mediterranean sky, a man was plotting his return. And that return would soon shake France, and with it, the destiny of the world. Part 2. The 100 Days and Waterloo. The winter of 1815 cloaked Europe in a fragile veil of peace, but beneath this apparent calm, a rumble was brewing. On his island of Elba, Napoleon had never ceased to watch, listen, dream, and soon his dream became a decision. In the night of February 26, 1815, he boarded a small ship, the Inconstant, with a few hundred loyal followers. The sails caught the wind, and the emperor, standing at the prow, fixed his gaze on the horizon. His coat flapped in the sea breeze, and his eyes burned with a fierce glow. Behind him, Elba faded, a dark silhouette. Before him, France stretched vast, full of dangers and hopes. On March 1st, he landed on the coast at Golfe Juan, near Caen. There began the most extraordinary march in history, the flight of the Eagle. Without artillery, cavalry, or a true army, Napoleon advanced with a handful of men. But everywhere, instead of hostility, he met enthusiasm. Peasants rushed to him, soldiers sent to arrest him lowered their weapons. At Grenoble, he stood alone before a regiment, his coat open, offering his chest. "Soldiers, do you recognize me? If any of you wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." A frozen silence. Then suddenly a cry, "Long live the emperor!" The entire troop rallied. Thus, from town to town, the Eagle resumed its flight. Lyon welcomed him in jubilation, crowds cheered, and Paris soon trembled at the news of his return. Louis XIII, abandoned, fled in the night. On March 20th, 1815, Napoleon crossed the Tuileries gates again. The court he had left a year earlier acclaimed him as if the past year had been a bad dream. But Europe could not tolerate this return. The kings, terrified, formed a new coalition at once. They swore not to lay down arms until Napoleon was crushed. The emperor, in a few weeks, organized the defense. Forges roared, barracks filled, drums beat again. France once more prepared for war. In June 1815, Napoleon took the initiative. He marched toward Belgium, hoping to separate the English under Wellington from the Prussians under Blücher. His rapid maneuvers initially succeeded. At Ligny, he defeated the Prussians. At Quatre Bras, he held them at bay. The Eagle seemed still capable of striking, but on June 18th, near a modest Belgian village called Waterloo, destiny awaited. That morning, rain had soaked the fields. Mud slowed movements, clinging to boots and cannon wheels. Napoleon, ailing, tired, surveyed the terrain. His marshals, Ney, Soult, others, awaited his orders. Facing him, Wellington, impassive, had chosen his positions with care, entrenching his men behind hedges, fortified farms, hills. The battle began late, too late. French artillery roared, but the mud dulled the cannonball's power. Infantry columns surged forward, bayonets gleaming, drums beating, but broke against the English lines. Ney, fiery, launched charge after charge of cavalry. Thousands of cuirassiers, sabers drawn, galloped across the plain, their armor glinting under the gray sky. But without infantry support, they exhausted themselves, cut down by British squares. All afternoon, the battle hung in the balance. Smoke covered the plain. Rain fell in gusts. Cries and cannon thunder formed an apocalyptic roar. Napoleon, sitting briefly on a chair, his face grim, observed the movements. His aides-de-camp urged him to commit the Imperial Guard. Finally, at dusk, he gave the order. The old guard, a black and imposing column, advanced in solemn silence. Drums beat slowly. Voices rose. "Long live the Emperor!" All knew the moment was decisive. Napoleon followed them with his gaze like a father watching his sons march to the ultimate test. But suddenly, from the woods, a clamor arose. Blücher's Prussians arrived. Their columns poured onto the French flank. The battle, until then balanced, turned brutally. The Imperial Guard, struck from the side, wavered. The English fired a devastating volley. The ranks broke, and for the first time, the Guard retreated. Then a terrible cry spread, "The Guard is retreating!" It was as if the universe itself cracked. The entire army collapsed. Soldiers discarded their weapons. The retreat became a rout. Napoleon tried to rally, to command still, but the human tide swept him away. He had to leave the field, escorted by a few faithful, as night fell on a field littered with the dead, broken horses, abandoned flags. Waterloo was not just a defeat, it was the end of a world. The next day, Napoleon resigned himself. In a country house, grim, he wrote, "I tried to save France, I failed, my star is fading." Back in Paris, he abdicated a second time. But this time, there was no nearby island, no gilded exile. His enemies demanded absolute removal. They decided to send him to a rock lost in the South Atlantic, St. Helena. Thus ended the 100 days, a dazzling flash that had shaken Europe once more. In less than 3 months, Napoleon had reclaimed a throne, defied empires, led an army, and lost everything again. But in this disaster, a legend was born. Waterloo, the name of an obscure village, would become that of a universal myth. And the man who had once crowned himself would now become the defeated hero, the broken eagle, destined for eternal exile. Part 3. St. Helena, the Emperor's Twilight. The summer of 1815 was fading, and with it the flamboyant destiny of a man. After Waterloo, Napoleon had briefly believed he could find refuge in the United States, embarking at Rochefort. But the English ships awaited, implacable masters of the seas. Cornered, he had no choice but to surrender. On July 15th, he boarded the Bellerophon, a British vessel. On the deck, standing his gaze steady, he declared, "I come, like Themistocles of old, to sit at the hearth of the British people. I surrender to their generosity." But generosity was not forthcoming. London decided to send him far, very far, to a rock lost in the middle of the South Atlantic, more than 2,000 kilometers from any land, St. Helena, an absolute exile, an oceanic cage from which no one could escape. In October, the ship Northumberland carried him to his final abode. The weeks of crossing were long, monotonous, punctuated only by the rolling of the waves and the whistling of the wind. Sometimes Napoleon went on deck, gazing at the empty horizon. He stood motionless for hours, hands clasped behind his back, a gray silhouette against the infinite. His companions in exile, Bertrand, Montholon, Gourgaud, Las Cases, respected his silence. They already saw in this posture a legendary image, the emperor meditating before the eternal ocean. On October 15th, 1815, St. Helena finally appeared, a dark mass battered by waves, bristling with steep cliffs, nothing welcoming. The low sky, the rain, the incessant wind gave the island an almost funereal austerity. Napoleon, upon seeing it, murmured, "So this is my final battlefield." He was first housed at Briar's Pavilion, then at Longwood House, a damp and dilapidated dwelling, battered by winds, infested with rats. There, surrounded by a vigilant English garrison, watched by the rigid and suspicious Governor Hudson Lowe, Napoleon would live the last 6 years of his existence. The days passed, monotonous, marked by limited horseback rides, frugal meals, conversations with his faithful. Las Casas took notes of his words, soon gathered in the Memorial of St. Helena, which would give the world the image of a heroic martyr. Napoleon recounted his campaigns, his victories, his reforms. His words, dictated in the dampness of Longwood, already carried the power of legends. Often he reflected on his life. Before his companions he said, "What I want is not to be loved, but to be understood. I governed out of necessity, I struck out of duty. History will judge." His walks took on a ritual air. Under the wind sweeping the hills, he sometimes paused, gazing at the horizon. In his eyes reflected both nostalgia and pride. He recalled the plains of Austerlitz, the suns of Italy, the cheers of Paris. The contrast with the island's solitude made him almost unreal, as if he lived already in a world between memory and eternity. His health declined. Fevers, stomach pains gnawed at him. His complexion yellowed, his strength waned, but his mind remained sharp. To the end, he continued to speak, dictate, reflect on Europe, peoples, laws. One evening, watching the sunset over the Atlantic, he said to Bertrand, "If I had had the sea as an ally, the world would have been too small for me. But see, it has become my prison." In the spring of 1821, his illness worsened. In his dark, damp, heavy room, he spent his final days surrounded by his companions. At times, he delirious, reliving his campaigns. He was heard murmuring, "Head of the army, Josephine." His mind wandered between love, war, and power. On May 5, 1821, a storm battered the island. The wind howled around Longwood. In the dim room, Napoleon, lying down, breathed his last. His eyes closed gently. He was 51. At that moment, the ocean stood still, as if the entire universe held its breath. The eagle had ceased to beat its wings, but its shadow already stretched into the memory of men. He was buried in a verdant valley on St. Helena, at a place called Geranium Valley. Willows were planted around the simple, nameless tomb, marked only by silence. The English soldiers rendered honors, and the faithful shed bitter tears. But the legend did not fade. Very soon, Europe, and France above all, began to dream of this fallen Napoleon, prisoner, broken hero. In homes, in songs, in books, his memory transformed. The Emperor of Battles became the Emperor of the Imagination. Years later, in 1840, his ashes were repatriated to France, placed in the Invalides under a monumental tomb. But already, even before this triumphal return, Napoleon belonged to eternity. On St. Helena, in the evening of his life, he had murmured these words, confided to Las Casas: "My true glory is not in having won 40 battles. Waterloo will erase many memories, but what will never die, what will live eternally, is my civil code." Thus ended the epic, not in the clamor of a battle, but in the breath of the Atlantic wind, not amid cheers, but in the silence of a lost island. And yet, in that silence, immortality already resonated. Napoleon Bonaparte, child of Corsica, General of the Revolution, Emperor of the French, prisoner of a rock, remained forever the eagle. Thus ended the life of Napoleon Bonaparte, born on an island of rock and wind, died on another, lost in the middle of the ocean. Between these two shores, he had crossed history like a comet. Solitary child, ardent adolescent, general of the Revolution, emperor of the French, he was all at once. His character, a blend of fire and ice, made him elusive, impulsive at times, always calculating. He combined superhuman energy with cold lucidity. In his dark eyes burned a flame that galvanized men and frightened his enemies. His authority came not only from his victories, but from that intimate conviction he carried. He was a man of destiny. His achievements were immense. He transformed France by giving it laws that outlived his empire. He dominated Europe with his lightning victories, disrupted balances, made the oldest thrones tremble. He etched his name in the plains of Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram. Even in defeat, he remained great. Moscow in flames, Leipzig, Waterloo, so many tragedies that still feed his legend. One may debate his ambition, his excesses, his failures, but no one can deny that he was one of the greatest strategists of all time, a master of movement, artillery, lightning marches, and enveloping maneuvers. His military genius remains studied in all the academies of the world, 2 centuries after his death. Napoleon did not merely govern. He shaped an era in his image, rapid, brilliant, violent, unforgettable. And yet, this tale was but a prelude. For behind the man's destiny lies another epic, that of the battles. The sons of Austerlitz, the fires of the Berezina, the cavalry charges, the columns of grenadiers. So many scenes where his art of command unfolds. In a future video, we will plunge into the heart of these battles. We will follow the emperor on his battlefields, describe his maneuvers, his intuitions, his triumphs, and his errors. We will enter the mind of the strategist, the one who, more than anyone, knew how to transform war into science and legend. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through history. I hope this tale has brought you peace and wonder. Don't forget to subscribe to Twilight Tales for more stories to guide you into a serene sleep. Take care, and see you soon.